Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm blown away by seeing your participations. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Zia Haq. I'm the director of Baker Institute. I teach in Peace Studies program at Juniata. And I feel very humbled to say this, that it's been almost 50 years that Peace Studies program at Juniata College, providing the academic leadership in the field of peace building and conflict resolution. Beyond offering our majors and minors, our applied courses, we offer workshops, we do symposiums, we bring guests, and we create a space for everybody to engage in a civic dialogue to understand the issues, contemporary issues. So the mission of our institute is to study conflict as human problems and peace as human potential. We firmly believe that peace is everybody's business. No matter where we live, what our stakes are, our vision of a peaceful world, we all share, we aspire that vision, and so we can prosper and thrive together. So to further that vision, my colleagues and I are very happy to put together a panel of experts. We invited 7 scholars tonight to talk about the contemporary international issues, their global and regional implications. Please join me welcoming our symposium guests and give them a big round of applause. I'm so grateful to you for your swift acceptance of our invitation and for visiting our campus tonight. And Amar, Abdallah, Caitlin Granger, thank you so much for all your hard work. As you can imagine, we are seeing significant changes in international systems. The system of global governance, the Western system of global governance being questioned, challenged on many fronts, politically, militarily, financially. We see changes that are happening, which is we see happen in 100 years. There are coalition of blocs, countries, no-limit friendships challenging the authority of the system, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the growing competition between major powers in Asia and the West makes things even unpredictable. At the micro levels, families are struggling to buy foods because of global inflation. America enjoyed an unprecedented privilege of having dollar as the global currency. But because of the weaponization sometimes of dollar, we see a coalition of countries trying to create alternative currency and dethrone dollar as global currency. So what does it mean to live in a turbulent time like this? What can you do to prevent this? Can other countries rise peacefully? These are significant questions that I don't have any easy answers. So tonight we are looking forward to our experts to have a very engaging discussion about these issues. So without further ado, may I please invite our Provost, Professor Lauren Bowen, to welcome our guests and begin the symposium proceedings. Thank you so much for your question.
Good evening. That's okay. As Zia indicated, it is really a joy to see so many of you gathered for this very important symposium. And I was thinking about it, and I said this to our panelists at lunch earlier today. What a poignant week to gather to talk about the new Cold War and the need to try and foster peace and conflict resolution actively. For those of us who identify as living in the United States, the last few days have been extraordinary on the national scene as we nearly halted the federal government, in part over whether or not we wanted to provide support to Ukraine. And yesterday, of course, the Speaker of the House of Representatives was ousted in part as a result of compromise, of seeking to find resolution. And so to underscore this conversation about what does it mean to be part of a global community, both as leaders of a nation state, but also as citizens. I can't think of a better moment for us to gather and to draw upon the wisdom and the expertise of our panelists. As we were talking at lunch today, it was poignant and clear that what they bring to this conversation is certainly scholarly wisdom and expertise, but also practice and experience born from their careers. And as we think about what we do at Juniata and how we define a liberal arts education, it is, of course, theory that we seek to translate into practice, that we understand the power of experience, the building of skills, the ability to listen, the development of empathy, that you must be grounded in theory, and yet how you take those ideas and how you work to understand that peace is not merely the absence of war. It is creating the material conditions that allow all humans to thrive. And so our panelists tonight and tomorrow night will engage us in that conversation. And I suspect, in addition to sharing their wisdom, they will provide implicitly or explicitly a call to action for each of us so that we too can be peace builders and peacemakers. So I want to welcome all of you to Juniata College. I want to thank you for joining us, for sharing your experience and your wisdom. And I would also like to pause and thank those faculty who comprise the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at Juniata College, Jim Bogart, Uma Ramakrishnan, Henry Thurston Griswold, and Allison Fletcher, for their contributions, their intellectual imagination, their commitment to interdisciplinarity here at Juniata. And of course, this does not happen with the leadership of Zia Haq, his vision, his commitment, his grace, the imagination and the energy and the logistical skills of Caitlin Granger, and the presence and the wisdom and the experience of Amr Abdallah. Please join me in thanking all of them for making this happen. On behalf of all of us at Juniata, it's a privilege to welcome you to our campus. It's a joy to welcome you to this symposium. I'm really excited and eager to hear the conversation. And so without further ado, I'll give it back to Zia Haq.
Thank you, Lauren, so much. Your presence in our events inspires us. So I would like to invite Dr. Amr Abdallah on stage. But before I do that, so I want to say something about Amr. Amr and I met 2008. I was students and I fell in love with his class teaching, and he became my lifelong mentor. So when I started my position here as a director, I invited Amr to help me build this program and do this amazing program, symposium like this. This is a collective vision to increase our reach, invite our scholars here to come and share their perspective about important issues. So Amr will be our MC and we'll talk about symposium, the proceedings, how we're going to conduct this panel. Welcome, Amr, please.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Very good. I mean, I'm so happy. It is really an honor and pleasure to stand here in front of all of you in a full room like this, and with distinguished scholars and colleagues from all over the world to speak about such an important topic. I am grateful to Juniata College. I am grateful to the Baker Institute for making the space for things like this to happen. And as Provost Bowen said, this is not possible without the vision and without the will to make such activities take place in a space that is safe and that is designed to exchange ideas and to expect that we have differences and that we will know how to work with differences in a peaceful, constructive manner. Today, we are pleased to bring 7 speakers representing also the philosophy of Juniata College and the Baker Institute. We are bringing people who represent not only different parts of the world, but also different themes that are important to this topic. We were hoping for everyone to be here, but we were successful. We got 6 out of 7 to actually come all the way here, from as far as Japan and Qatar and Ethiopia. Only one of our colleagues, Ambassador Fatima Mohammed, was unable to come in person, but she has a pre-recorded presentation for you. The way we designed this the symposium, we're going to have two panels. The first panel will be led by our colleague, Professor Emil Nagengast, a professor of politics and international relations at Juniata College. And with him will be three speakers who we want them to provide to us some of the key themes related to the idea of Cold War, and be followed by the perspective of Africa that will be presented by Ambassador Fatima Mohammed from Nigeria on video, and of course will be presented also by the Horn of Africa. Next day, tomorrow, we're going to have the second panel that will be led by Professor Jim Totten, and we will be exploring regional perspectives on the concept of the new Cold War. The success of this symposium is not only about the great speakers and scholars who you will listen to today and tomorrow. It is also about your engagement and about how you will participate with your critical thinking, with your questions, your reflections and perspectives. And I am sure that our colleagues are eager here to listen to you and to engage with all of you. I also would like to highlight that we have also, of course, the presence not only of scholars and academicians, but also distinguished diplomats representing the Netherlands, representing the African Union, and other places as well. And we think that this is going to enrich the discussion. So it is also definitely about the scholarly work about what is the Cold War, and is there a new one, and how does it look like, and how can we move about it peacefully, but also about the practice on the ground and the rich experience that we are getting from people who worked on the ground for many decades. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the first panel with our colleague, Professor Emil Nagengast. Professor Nagengast.
I know a lot of you were asking yourselves, what is Nagengast doing up there? So anyway, as Amr explained, I'm the moderator. One of the directions he gave me last week was you must be very strict with time. So I was almost going to be waving this at you, Amr. All right, so I'm going to be in charge of time management. Our speakers know they're allotted 20 minutes each. And I will introduce them as each of them are coming up. As Amr said, we have three here and one will be on video. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Chris Dolan, Director of the Master's Program in Intelligence and Security Studies and Director of the Center of Political History at Lebanon Valley College. So let's welcome Dr. Dolan.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Oh gosh. Oh no.
And then it says old wine and new bones.
Yes. I had to come up with. I wanted to come up with a catchy title, but that's the biggest head that I've ever seen. Wow. Yeah. Now I'm awake. Okay. So yes. Thank you to Juniata College, the Baker Institute, my hosts. I really appreciate this time that's been allotted to me. The way I see my role here is I'm, yes, a professor of intelligence and security studies at LVC in Anvil, but I am a three-time Fulbrighter, and most of my work is in the Balkans. And I'm going back to Kosovo, where I was on my first Fulbright in January, and I got the unique opportunity to actually practice what I preach to my students in the classroom, and that is capacity building, civil society initiatives, rule of law, anti-state capture, anti-political corruption initiatives in a region that is in a post-conflict, is considered a post-conflict society, the former Yugoslavia. So last year for 7 months, I was in the Republic of North Macedonia. 2 years before that, I was in Kosovo, and I'm going back to Kosovo in January. So what I'm going to do is provide a series of insights into what I see is the return of the Cold War, but a Cold War 2.0. And the reason why I argue that is, and so I have to have this disclaimer, the work I did as a Fulbright is is my work. It's not part of the State Department's, even though the State Department paid for it. So why is there a Cold War 2.0? Well, I wrote 2 books on it, so there has to be. This has to work. So if there isn't conflict, we're going to make it conflictual this evening. So my first book is more on the international system and how it's impacted the United States and great power competition, the return of it between the U.S., China, and Russia. And the second book, The Politics of U.S. Foreign Policy and NATO, I do a lot of my writing on NATO, is more about domestic politics in the United States and how, as was introduced by the provost, is incredibly dysfunctional. So, and I'm going to be moving from the international system to the domestic political scene, and I need to be very careful with my language, because when we say international order and international community, you should know that many people in the United States simply mean the West when they say that. So that's 20% of the world's population. It's not the entire world. So I'm very aware of that, so I just wanted to throw that out as a qualifier. So remember the beginning of the year with the spy balloon, the Chinese spy balloon, right? And the hysteria that had caused. And that is nothing new in American political history, as we had the Red Scare in the late 40s, 1950s with McCarthyism. So this is what I mean by when I say old wine in new bottles. And the hysteria as it defined American politics, and how there's an emerging almost bipartisan consensus about the role of China as a strategic threat to the United States and the risks that come with that, and how, and my argument is, it didn't have to be that way, but it is, and I think a lot of that is indicative of the structure of American politics, how we're wired politically in the United States, and how it's nothing new. And did anyone see Oppenheimer? Yeah. The movie, it's great film. But it's about how one man struggled to build an atomic bomb that kills a lot of people. Okay, so getting caught up in Christopher Nolan's approach, one has to remember that there was, yes, a horrible human tragedy took place at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes, in the United States, that was framed as we ended the war, we saved American lives, but how many lives had to be lost and killed in those 2 atomic at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so the Cold War begins with the advent of atomic weapons and atomic technology, and what is defining the US and China strategic or security competition, but a chip war, right? A battle over the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and quantum computing, biotechnology, bioengineering, human enhancements, all of these different advanced technologies that are that these 2 nation states are competing over. So yes, a security competition between both countries, and it's similar to Cold War 1.0, or the original Cold War, in that it's heavily and advanced in terms of technology. Okay, so now I'm going to come back to sort of the United States. We say we're a democracy in the United States, but are we really democratic? And so I pulled these data points from Statista, which is really just kind of a reproduction or a republication of the VDEM statistical database, which measures the extent to which a nation state is a democracy. And as you can see here, from the 1920s to the 1940s, using this definition, there weren't that many democracies. There certainly weren't that many what are called liberal democracies or electoral democracies. An electoral democracy is, yes, there may be a free election or a free and fair election, but there might not be protections for marginalized groups, for communities of color, for ethnic minorities in places like the Balkans. In Kosovo, there are free and fair elections, but 5% of the country is ethnically Serb, Turkish, and so what are the protections for those particular groups when one ethnic majority has significant political power in that country? So a liberal democracy is a democracy that protects marginalized groups, targeted groups. And so it's a very narrow definition. And as you can see, well, in 2021, there are only 34 of them in the world. And the United States is categorized as a liberal democracy, but this was taken before Roe v. Wade was overturned last year. So the United States, I don't know if it's going to continue in this category, to be quite honest with you, because of the removal of reproductive rights as a civil right. And so right now in the world, as you can see, closed autocracies or electoral autocracies make up about 88, there are about 88 nation states in the world, whereas there are 89 electoral or liberal democracies. The state of democracy in the United States, and this is the trend from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, the overall trend, I mean, I don't want to be too data oriented here, even though I love data, I assume that many of you don't, but this provides a nice picture of the so-called trend lines and the extent to which democracy is a slightly declining factor over the last almost 18 years in the United States, as you can see. We are becoming slowly more undemocratic as a country, yet we call ourselves normatively a democracy. So according to the data and the statistics, there's a relative decline or relative deterioration of democracy in the United States. Okay, now I'm going to kind of go out to the international system. And this is the way the US sees the so-called Indo-Pacific region of the world, right, where 50% of the world's population lives. And so the US sees a rising China, militarization of the Indo-Pacific. China's building fake reclaimed projects and islands with airfields, and the US sees that as a strategic threat to its interests. It looks at the Pacific, in particular the South China Sea, as its region, right? And it's going to sail freedom of navigation, I guess, in the region, and it sees it as its area that it should have freedom of navigation over. Okay, so the building of these islands is seen as a direct threat to the United States and American power. And as also you can see here on the left, there's a significant level of military buildup in the region, and the United States is trying to form military alliances that are formal and informal with certain key nation states in the region. So the region is going to become even more militarized as a result of the U.S. response to what the U.S. sees as China's militarization of a region that it should have what's called hegemony over. Okay, the China-Russia partnership. The United States looks at the China-Russia partnership, or what I call the China-Russia partnership, as an even bigger threat. And this has led to less of a unipolar world and perhaps more of a multipolar or a bipolar world. And it's kind of a bifurcated world. We could have a play on terms all day, but the way in which the United States sees this is China and Russia are moving together. While they have their differences, and they've had their history of differences, especially during the original Cold War, the U.S. sees them as coming together, and they share a unified interest in opposing an American-led world. But as America sees that, it's the entire world. As China and Russia sees it, well, it's not just a Western-led world, and this gets played out over the invasion of Ukraine. In my interviews with U.S. policymakers, the way they see it is as follows: the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. had to respond militarily to assist the Zelensky government as a deterrent to what? China and Taiwan. And so if the U.S. didn't provide Ukraine military assistance, that would just be an incentive for China to move against Taiwan. And China has said by 2027 it will want to unify with Taiwan. However, it defines that. Now that could be a full-scale military invasion. Larry Diamond, a famous scholar on democracy, says that is going to happen, and the U.S. getting more and more involved in Ukraine is going to be even more of an incentive for China to launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And I don't know to what extent that is certain, or if that's a clarion call for more awareness, but that is a relative consensus in the scholarship of American foreign policy, that will happen. My area is NATO, China, and Russia. And this is where I offer kind of my viewpoint. The United States has, in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, the United States has move to convey an approach of NATO unity. That is, the US and its European allies are now united, they're on the same page, they're pushing back against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They wish that they had, they're engaging in revisionist history. They wish that they had pushed back even harder after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But there's a certain bit of hypocrisy associated with this. The United States did invade Afghanistan and Iraq. And now it is telling Russia that it is not allowed to invade Ukraine. So there is a bit of hypocrisy here. So I'm just as critical of the United States as I am of Russia invading Ukraine. Yeah, Russia did not have to invade Ukraine. That was not a decision that was set in stone. And I agree with much of the U.S. response, because the U.S. has a Cold War mentality that flows from the Cold War. So the Cold War mentality with the Soviet Union is now applying to Ukraine. And there is this view that if the US does not respond, it will only encourage China to invade Taiwan. Okay? So there are these strategic narratives that are at play. But remember, yes, Russia did not have to invade Ukraine, but the United States did not have to invade Iraq. And that is something we need to look at. We need to diagnose what the United States is doing around the world and how it's coming across. So we look like hypocrites when we say something to the effect of Russia should have never been allowed to annex Crimea or then launch a full-scale reinvasion or invasion of Ukraine when the United States is doing such things itself. Okay, what is happening in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Yes, China and Russia are forming a partnership. I do not know to what extent that partnership is lasting, because they're not on the same page as many people think, but it's a informal alliance of mutual convenience in opposition to a U.S.-led world. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. military assistance to Ukraine in the wake of that has led Russia to now form a partnership with North Korea. And Russia is firing, now bear with me here, per month, 2 million artillery shells per month in Ukraine. 2 million. But it can only produce 1 million. So it has run out of artillery, or running out of artillery. There are US sanctions on Russian defense industrial base. Where's the world's repository of artillery shells? The Korean Peninsula. And so Vladimir Putin has to go to Iran for drones, because he can't get parts to build his own drones. And now he has to go to North Korea for artillery. And so last month, Kim Jong-un takes an armored train car over to the Russian Cosmodrome, right? It's kind of ridiculous. He's afraid to fly. So he takes this armored train car across the very narrow border with Russia. He meets Vladimir Putin, and they're dining on tea and fish, and they're having a good time. But Russia is in a position where it needs North Korea. And so this is a very dangerous situation. So when we're talking about the long-term implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the U.S. response to it, this meeting here illustrates that. And so my view, my perspective, my conclusion is that we are now seeing the emergence of a security competition that could lead to the breakout of an all-out major power war. And the weapons of today may not necessarily be nuclear. And by the way, North Korea is interested in ballistic missile technology that Russia has. And so that's even more destabilizing. So there are long-term implications in Northeast Asia of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I'm going to go back to U.S. domestic politics. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Why did it seize Crimea illegally in 2014? Well, at the end of the Cold War, the United States promised not 1 inch that it would move NATO eastward. And there was a famous quote from former Secretary of State James Baker, who had promised, we will move not 1 inch eastward NATO. And that after the reunification of East and West Germany, that NATO would not expand beyond Germany. Well, it did. And it increased from 13 members to now it's going to be 32 with the admission of Sweden, inevitably next year, with the admission of Finland this year, and Sweden will most likely be admitted next year now that a deal has been struck with Turkey. So why did Russia respond the way it did in Georgia in 2008? Why did Vladimir Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference issue this condemnation of the West, and then, of course, 1 year later with the South Ossetia War in 2008, the seizure of Crimea in 2014, well, NATO expansion. But I mean, there's a lot more there than just NATO expansion. That is part of a Russian disinformation strategic narrative, to put the onus on the West. Therefore, Russia has to invade Ukraine, because this is a war about NATO expansion, American expansion into its near abroad. However, there's a lot more to this. The color revolutions that took place in Ukraine, Georgia, Lebanon, Kyrgyzstan, those really unnerved the Kremlin. That really was a threat to the governments of Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin. And also, NATO began putting national missile defense batteries in NATO countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So all of this represented a threat to Russia's and how it sees its sphere of influence. Now the United States is relying on its NATO partners to push back against Russia. So there's tension, the reigniting of tensions in Europe. And the US and Russia are both responsible for that. And in response to China's militarization of islands, the US is now forming these, what it calls more flexible, more adaptable informal alliances like the Quad, the US, India, Japan, and Australia, and AUKUS, the Australia, United Kingdom, United States defense arrangement, which is more about nuclear submarines and cybersecurity technology. And President Biden just came back from a trip to Vietnam to raise Vietnam's role in US foreign policy. So what I'm going to do here is, my conclusion is back to American politics. And that is, what we're seeing here, my estimation, is this is more about what's happening inside the United States than anything else. Globalization is done in American politics. The era of economic globalization is over with. What we're witnessing now is an economy that's gearing up for strategic security competition with China first and Russia second. And we're seeing that with a Biden foreign policy that really is nothing more than an extension of the Trump foreign policy. There are a lot of similarities between the two. Yet I think that Biden has actually taken Trump's foreign policy and kind of put it on steroids. He has not eliminated tariffs against China. The Buy America Act of 2021 was passed. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law of 2021 was passed. The Chips and Sciences Act and the Inflation Reduction Acts were passed last year, and export controls on high technologies like AI and machine learning. All of that was sold to Congress, and much of this was passed with overwhelming majorities as an attempt to compete with China. Everything in the U.S. economy that eventually evolved into the military-industrial complex was sold as a way of containing the Soviet Union. So we're building a war economy, or a war economy that existed even after the end of the Cold War, and that is now expanding to a great degree. So as much as I want to say, and I do believe this, that the ultimate issue that facing humanity is actually not the strategic competition between the U.S., China, and Russia, the U.S. and its allies, China and Russia, it's climate change. And there's so much there that could be done in the area of peace building. And I saw this one with my work in the Balkans. And there's so much more there in the area of cooperation, but I think that we're way past that now. The world and the future of human history is going to be defined more in terms of tension and competition, and it just didn't need to be that way. So thank you very much.
I forgot to add before, I'm only reading their titles. Each of our experts have long biographies that I didn't want to take up. But those are available if you go on the announcement. Zia posted them today in the Arch. If you want to go in and open up the announcement, you'll see more details about each of our speakers. Okay, next up, Dr. Emily Welty, who was here, we were trying to establish, we think 5 years ago. She is the Director of Peace and Justice Studies at Pace University. She's part of the 2017 Nobel Prize-winning international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Welcome, Emily. All right, thank you, Emily. Our next speaker via technology is going to be Ambassador Fatima Mohammed. There she is, the permanent observer, otherwise known as the Ambassador of the African Union to the UN. One other announcement I think we forgot to make is in terms of our schedule. So after we hear from Fatima and one more speaker, We're going to have a 10-minute break, and then there will be time for question and answers and discussion of everything we've heard here today.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Permit me to start by thanking the Baker Institute, and in particular Dr. Zia Haq and Dr. Amr Abdullah for this kind invitation. I regret that I'm unable to join you for this symposium in person, but I'm also grateful that technology provides the opportunity for me to share some thoughts on the topic from an African perspective. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Geopolitical tensions have intensified over the last decade, and the idea of a new Cold War due to heightened geopolitical competition between major powers has and could have several impacts on Africa. There are, of course, a number of factors fueling these tensions, which can contribute to a situation where direct military conflict between major powers is less likely, but where proxy conflicts and competition in various domains become more prevalent in Africa. Africa, as a continent, has historically been influenced by the dynamics of global power struggles, and these have had and continues to have both positive and negative impacts on certain countries and regions within the continent. The Cold War, which lasted up to the early 1990s and had a profound impact on Africa, affecting its political, economic, and social development in various ways. And while many African countries gained independence during this period, the Cold War competition occasionally led to infrastructure development and economic support, but the overall impact on the continent's development trajectory was complex and multifaceted. The new Cold War narrative presumes that African countries will always be passive participants in global affairs and must choose a side. But African countries are now intentional about articulating and pursuing their own national interests. They are charting their own courses and must not be drawn into a false choice between two options. This is particularly pertinent because while Africa is a diverse continent with various countries that range from middle income to least development and small and in developing states, that interests and ideologies may also vary. It is important to note that there are some key considerations regarding the continent's place in the future world order, which is influenced by a complex set of evolving factors. Today, as Africa faces new challenges in the context of a potential new Cold War, in particular, African nations are seeking to learn from the past and pursue more sustainable and self-determined paths to development and economic integration. But this requires a multifaceted approach that encompasses good governance, conflict prevention, economic development, strengthening efforts to mitigate the drivers of conflicts, and human security promotion in Africa. The African Union as a continental body plays a pivotal role in this regard. The adoption of a continental approach to security not only enhances national and continental security, but also contributes to the overall stability, development, and prosperity of the continent. The African Peace and Security Architecture and the African Governance Architecture of the African Union are critical frameworks that align with Africa's economic development strategy by addressing peace and security challenges comprehensively. These frameworks, as well as the AU Silencing the Guns initiative, are fundamental for strengthening African ownership and coordination in promoting peace and security on the continent, and play a pivotal role in shaping Africa's approach to conflict prevention and management, to strengthen good governance and to consolidate democracy that works for the people. However, this remains work in progress, and the application of various aspects also varies. The priority for most African countries and the African Union in the present geopolitical landscape is to secure and strengthen ownership of its destiny in the spirit of finding durable solutions for its challenges and to escape from the polarization that is marking the political and diplomatic spheres in Africa. Such an endeavor will naturally require not only ownership and implementation on national and sub-regional levels through national policies, the regional economic communities and regional mechanisms, but also important resources to mobilize, particularly in terms of peace enforcement in difficult conflict settings. In addition, the road towards full ownership cuts through the inevitable development quest through the intensification of intra-African trade and continental integration. The operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area is a concrete expression of the African Union in this regard. The continent's economic potential, its demographic trends, its security challenges, and diplomatic engagements with global powers all contribute to its position on the global stage. Its agency in addressing its own challenges and its contributions to various global issues from peacekeeping to climate change continue to grow in importance and is increasingly recognized. Now, with those reflections, permit me to conclude with these few remarks. First, the evolution of the new Cold War and its impact on the future world order will vary significantly on the continent depending on the actions and strategies of the involved parties. What is important to note is that the African nations have agency and can and should shape their own responses to the evolving global geopolitical landscape. Ultimately, the impact will depend on how African nations navigate these complex dynamics and how major powers choose to engage with the continent. The focus should be on minimizing the negative consequences of great power competition, especially on its populations. Second, there's a need to rethink the global peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding approaches in Africa, and indeed globally. For Africa's security architecture to be effective and impactful, a division of labor based on the principle of subsidiarity between the African Union and its sub-regional bodies where decisions and actions can be taken is required and should be strengthened and supported. In this regard, the United Nations' new agenda for peace calls for stronger national leadership, ownership, and enhanced support for the African Union and sub-regional peace support operations, including through assessed contributions, as well as the need for the reform of the UN Security Council and a revitalized UN General Assembly. I must emphasize here that the financing of AU-led peace support operations, which has to come from UN assessed contributions, while bearing in mind that the UN has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, will be crucial for the continent in its quest towards ownership. Third, a conscious effort must be made to sensitize, educate, and invest in initiatives that ensure all spheres of the population are heard and can contribute meaningfully to society. Marginalization fuels conflict and easily creates environments for others to use and manipulate. Inclusion in all aspects of peace, security, socioeconomic development, and decision-making, especially of our youth and women, is critical as an important step towards deepening their participation in prevention, peace building, and stabilization processes. International efforts in Africa must also focus much more on ensuring agency and resilience, particularly in communities, to enhance the welfare and well-being of all citizens, rather than pushing for binary choices in a supposed second Cold War. Lastly, strengthening of our prevention mechanisms through preventive diplomacy, dialogue, and international cooperation remain critical tools for managing and mitigating tensions in this complex environment. We must use and, where necessary, reform our existing institutions to strengthen multilateralism, as a growing multipolar world cannot be good for the future of humanity. I hope with these reflections, I have left you with some food for thought, and I hope that my contributions today will generate some interesting debate. I thank you for your attention and wish you fruitful deliberations.
All right, Caitlin just told me she needs a minute to, that didn't take very long. So I will introduce our next speaker, and I'll do it slowly. Dr. Jonas Adeto, did I say your last name correctly?
Perfect.
Yeah, wow. Commissioner at the Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission, and Director Emeritus of the Institute of Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Okay, go ahead.
The beauty of being last is to have been listening to fine presentations, and the worst side of it is maybe having the risk of repetition of what's been said already. Let me start with thank you very, very much indeed, the institute, Bacon Institution here, our institute, and Provost, Excellency, Director and Professor here, and Organizer Caitlin, for excellent organization and of course making us come together in this very small village that made by, again, the advancement of science and technology. And today, my focus, before I start what I'm doing there, I had also greetings and warm wishes from great-great-great-great-grandma called Lucy, who was found in Ethiopia. You might have heard of her. No? Okay, yeah, sure. Right. So greetings to all of you then from Addis Ababa University as well. Right. I'll focus on this topic, strategic competition for Africa and the new Cold War. I'll try to focus on 4 points. The first one, sort of strategic competition for Africa in general. I'll take only 3 points from there, going back to the time of colonialism, and then what looks like during the true Cold War, or old Cold War, or previous Cold War, and then how Africa, in both ways, either through its attraction and at the same time it is repulsion, how these tensions are really causing this Cold War to happen, and how Africa is going to be not only the cradle of human being, but also cradle of shaping the new world order. And he who wins Africa might win the new world order, might be also the leader as well, as we'll see together. And finally, I'll focus on its implication for the future world order. This is just what it looked like from 1885 to 1914 as background for you. Whenever we're talking about Cold War, what really we are talking about, you can see this colonization of Africa in 1885 to 1994. Just you can look at all the green talking about French, or the red talking about Britain or British imperialism, the rest German, Portuguese, Italian, Belgian, Spanish, independent countries. Only my country is that of course Liberia. The rest being all those two. I'm not being this and that, because once my neighbors are under colonialism, we too are under colonialism as well. Because that's Africa's philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are. Right, so this is the foundation. That colonial project had this project also from 1945 to 1989. Look at the map again. So NATO up there, and Warsaw together, which is presented very beautifully by our friend Professor Chris. I'm using African English by saying Professor Chris by first name rather than going to the family name deliberately defyingly. And other allies of the United States, you can see all the blue with the United States allies in Africa. And Warsaw Pact, you might just see from there, but other allies of the Soviet Union, including my country, during Cold War time, the first Cold War time, what it looked like. what makes Cold War Cold War? Why the very name itself? Our Shakespeare would tell us that you can call a rose by any other name, but still, what's in a name? So there is something in a name, to be honest. Yes, I fully agree with Her Excellency. All protocols, by the way, observed, so I don't have to break any rules and protocols in time. Cold War, for us who are suffering the consequence, it is really not cold. I fully agree with you. However, because they are making benefit out of that, who is a satellite, who is the follower, who opens the door for plundering and exploitation of raw materials, who are to obey before even they were instructed, rather than why, rather how. So these are sort of decolonizing the very mind as well. So it is continuation of the very colonialism as well. And today, as we speak here, do we have that again? Look at this. Only in the Horn of Africa, you can see about 11 foreign military bases in the Horn of Africa. You can see which countries are present there. And 33 countries with known presence in Africa for different purposes, and 34 US known outposts across the northern, western, and Horn Africa altogether. As we speak here in the 21st century, you can see what Cold War map looks like. Just food for thought, because I'm to spark more discussions, provoke more ideas than simply giving answers, because that is my role here, as I was already told. So geopolitical, economic, and historical factors can be taken as attracting powers for the Cold War great power players. These can be taken as point of attraction. So, such as Horn of Africa, if you just look at the only country, the only region in the entire Horn of Africa where you have two new de jure independent states, such as Eritrea and South Sudan, and one new de facto independent, such as Somaliland, and several regions under the control of insurgent movements, large areas that are only nominally under the control of central government because of questions of legitimacy, and of course many other related issues. And historical aspect, the colonial legacy again. One country, Ethiopia for instance, or Somalia, or Kenya, for instance, if I just take only Ethiopia, we have Somali ethnic group in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Kenya, in Djibouti, one nation divided into 3 or 4 sovereign states. That keeps on this attraction of what's called irredentism, that is previously divided ethnic groups attracting others through fighting. And these weaken, create state fragility and security aspect. And piracy, time and again, I'm sure you have been following that. And economical, from the economic aspect, the primary products, rich resources, particularly blue economy, fertile agricultural land, petroleum, hydrocarbon, and of course a lot there. Then you can see a lot of presence from Middle East, from here where I'm speaking from the US, from Russia, from China. So Africa being again crucible. Those gadgets that we are using here today, such as these or your mobiles, most of the raw materials happen to come from Central Africa, from South Africa, from Eastern Africa. So these are a point of attraction, again, for that attractive aspect which makes Africa, again, a crucible or playing ground or fighting ground. New political trends, particularly summits. Summits here, US-Africa Summit, Russia-Africa Summit, China-Africa Summit, Turkey-Africa Summit, India-Africa Summit, summit. All the prefixes host countries, the suffix Africa coming out. And forums, this forum again attached to Africa. And development aid, and many others. these are way of sweet talks or having coffee and tea in African culture. Before you get married, you have to have this coffee and tea time, and then that coffee tea is a name for the first persons, for the first would-be family to come together. Africa is not taken as coffee and tea place for the superpowers or great powers to come together and to another point. Right, and BRICS now, fast moving. Egypt and Ethiopia added into it. Other countries are coming into it, almost versus G7. MICTA, another, or that is Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia, another agreement, another arrangement, so as to divide in further and further. And the social aspect is another very interesting one, but I may not have more time to into it. Before I'm told to stop, I have to rush. Then climate-induced crisis, particularly drought, floods, crop failure, and cultural centers, German cultural area, the German cultural center, Italian cultural center, Confucius cultural center, Pushkin culture. You can see all of them related to, again, sort of great powers or regional powers. And they, again, are to divide Africa further and further and further. And another factor that makes Cold War likely are transnational security threats in Africa as a whole. I took simply Horn of Africa and West Africa. Very quickly in Africa, in Horn of Africa, particularly armed conflicts, terrorism and violent extremism, such as jihadists in Somalia and the neighboring IGAD member countries. The outbreak of civil war in Ethiopia, civil war in Sudan. As I speak here, again, still Sudan is suffering as it's been already raised. Only in Ethiopian case, just in Ethiopia, then you can see Eritrea and Sudan, and then IGAD, and from about 12 countries getting involved in only one case, attracting all of them, just showing us how much alignment and competition is really going on in Africa. Just this is taking an iceberg of the entire story. So these are just some of the groupings in Horn of Africa, and specifically the Daesh presence, what it looks like in Uganda, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, the presence. So these presence attract others in the name of interference, or rather intervention, or assisting or fighting terrorism. How that facilitates for great powers to structure the world after their image, after their likeness. And a summary of coup d'etats in Horn of Africa, in the West Africa. Since from 1960 to 2022, about 25 coups took place in West Africa. Very currently, I can just that one. So Burkina Faso, for instance, January 2022, and before I was just preparing myself to come here, the second attempt, Saturday, before this I started 2023, just September, it's 30th of September, another attempt in Burkina Faso, Chad in August 2021, Gabon, I'm sure you have heard, Guinea, Mali, Niger, they all have, even though there are coups in Africa, but they have their presence, their sources outside, mainly in Europe, particularly France, of course. And again, transnational security threats, particularly those terrorist groups as labeled by others, because the word terrorism, terrorists are very dangerous, don't have to call them, because one's terrorist is the other's freedom fighter. So ISIS, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, or Akim, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, and these all lists are again factors for greater power to come to Africa. As just natural resources attract, these conflicts also attract. Both tensions are a fertile ground for the great power to come to Africa. Just as a continuation of that, for them, the West, transnational terrorists operate in a globally networked web of member and affiliated groups, energized by religious zeal and hostility to the West. For them, the West is perceived as a threat to Islam, while conversely, the West views radical Islam as, of course, just following Samuel Huntington's thesis, Clash of Civilizations, dividing the world in two, the West and the rest. In the same way, does the thesis resonate with Russia-Ukraine conflict relating to Africa's position as seen from the West? Look at my grammar or semantics here. I used Russia-Ukraine conflict in Africa. You see it that way, for we see both of them as our friends. And we have been doing business, so many students, scholars from there, so we hate war, what's meant by war, we understand it. So we see as Russia-Ukraine. So this Russia-Ukraine conflict has been seen for some as almost Ukrainization of global security as well, some people argue. So if you don't support what's been supported by my friend earlier, our comrade, our colleague said a moment ago, when we are talking about international community, we are referring to, I'll keep quiet. And so if you don't call this is Russian invasion of Ukraine, then you are not with us. Either you are with this or with that. So as not to be onto this categorical aspect, we remain on the continuum, borrowing from philosophy of science, then saying that, well, this is of course conflict, death, war, we're against it, but both are our partners. The price in African markets of crops, of oil, of gas increased because of the war between there. We couldn't import grain from there. So we definitely are losers when both are fighting. We here as in African context. That's why we say, we call it Russia-Ukraine conflict. It seems to be definitely semantically as well as practically dividing the world into we, us, they dichotomy. And so implication for the future world order. Africa has become, as we said already, a crucible for great powers of our times, setting the scene for the new Cold War. As is an economic powerhouse in terms of natural resources, such as hydrocarbon, which you mentioned, strategic locations, particularly the strategic location. This strategic aspect, not only me, but Paul, the rise and fall of great powers. If you just look at that excellent history book, in it, Paul Kennedy's argument, how the economic aspect and the strategic locations can shape, how it shaped for the last 500 years the whole world. In the same way that the strategic location seems to be today, sending very clear signal that our world is also almost being reshaped following that strategic and economical resource factor. And Africa is replete with internal violence, which makes a huge market for weapon sales produced mainly, if not solely, by great powers. Market to just see both parties fighting Africa again. Coups and violent extremism widely spread in Africa, which are excuses for interference by the great powers, making Africa a fighting ground for alliance creation. You are with this or with that. Whichever country or bloc, either BRICS versus G7, influences Africa on the basis of summits or forum is likely to shape the future of the world. It seems, according to the data available on the ground. The present and recent past realities of pandemic, however, such as COVID-19, demand cooperation, strategic cooperation than strategic competition, honestly speaking. The sweeping drought, heat and floods, earthquakes, climate change effects, and all related human sufferings around the world point to a strategic cooperation rather than strategic competition. Hunger and global poverty require use of advanced economy and technology for meeting sustainable development goals, which we heard Secretary General was almost lamenting about the failure, rather than killing innocent children and harming the environment. Using advanced economy and technology to demonstrate war-making capabilities and strategic competition is not an answer to the global inequalities, from my understanding. Therefore, an alternative thinking is required to the present global modus operandi, the way it operates. An African philosophy of Ubuntu, therefore, is, from us, an answer, which is part of the paper I presented in St. Petersburg on African solution for global crisis, where the leaders were, some of them laughing, others were clapping, and so it's quite interesting. So far, good smiling I can see from the house here. Thank you so much indeed. And so an African philosophy of Ubuntu here, foundation of Pax Africana, that is African way of approaching to peace. I am, because you are, diversity, just celebrating diversity. Let's celebrate diversity and resolve differences through dialogue is the way out to save humanity and our planet from extinction, the imminent calamity and catastrophe which Her Excellency presented about getting rid of this nuclear altogether. So I think as we cooperate, I'm sure we can survive and prosper. Thank you very much indeed. Let me stop here.
All right, so as I said, we're going to take a 10-minute break. 10 minutes. So what we're going to do in 10 minutes, I'm going to be here taking questions, leading the discussion. If you don't, you can stay outside and drink tea and eat cookies if you want. I don't care. All right? So we'll be back here at 8:40. Thank you. That's what they're doing. All right, so we're going to have discussion, question and answer until 8:20. That is an hour off. Now I have, I'm on the schedule, I'm going to put that he wants me to give comments now, and I have a lot of fascinating comments to make, but I don't want to have to make them. We want to hear from you. So I'm going to shut up and just call on you and get your questions, your comments, complaints. Caitlin has a microphone, I think there's this. And we'll of course give preference to students. So.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. My question's for Dr. Welty. I was wondering if you could talk about how the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has impacted customary law and other forms of international law for non-signatories.
That's a great question. Well, one of the primary things is that the treaty has obligations for victim assistance. And we're finding that raising the profile on that means that we don't require you to sign the treaty in order to engage in more victim assistance. So there's a sort of welcoming pathway in for what we think of as the nuclear umbrella states, states that are hosting nuclear weapons on their soil, could still participate in this victim assistance and environmental remediation. But I think the most interesting things that are happening around finance. So we are seeing pension funds in Europe primarily, but also in the United States, who are starting to do the calculations that it's actually bad for business. I am always going to pivot to we should do the moral thing, and we should ask the moral question of what's the right thing to do first. But I understand that that might not be how financial markets work as much as I wish that it was. But what we are seeing is that with the entry into force of the TPNW, it is actually statistically, financially bad to be investing in nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are becoming a poor investment. And we're seeing pension funds then move money, not because they've had a sudden moral conscience call, but actually because the writing is on the wall that nuclear weapons will become obsolete and you don't want to remain invested in them. There are also really interesting implications potentially around international waters and where your jurisdiction is. And so when we saw small island states, so-called small island states are only small if you care only about land. But it is really important when you are thinking about the Pacific to think also about the ocean. So small island states are actually huge states if you look at oceans. So if you are a signatory and you say don't bring your nuclear weapons across these waters, we're actually looking at transport being a fairly significant thing. So those are the sort of key things that we're seeing so far in terms of what impact is this treaty having outside of signatory ratification states.
Thank Thank you all for coming. This is for Dr. Argento. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. I was just wondering, which way do you think the Horn of Africa would go? Would it lean more towards China and Russia, or would it be more Western or South America?
Thank you very much indeed for that extremely interesting question indeed. Horn of Africa, as we already saw in our previous discussion, is now a playing ground for Turkey, for China, for USA, for Russia as well, and NATO member countries, if you like, particularly the Red Sea area. And about 11 great power countries are there, even though great countries are. Right, so honestly speaking, if you look at what's on the ground in the Horn of Africa, who really is doing sustainable engagement in Horn of Africa? Who is really constructing railway from Djibouti to Addis Center? Who is engaging on educating and training and transforming, and particularly these social capital aspects, and again the human capital aspect? Who is more engaged? Who is really paving more ways for the young generation who really are looking, but most of the young generation are on almost no man's land. They are looking for their own identity. They like to get their expression. They like to be investors, engineers, medical doctors. They like to be these all. These opportunities are being approached. Free scholarship from China coming time and again. More investment. Practical infrastructure assistance coming out there. So not simply food aid or just, again, tied with conditionalities, but rather more investment in human development. So given those criteria, if you really look at them, analyze them very critically, getting all the data, then it seems that he who pays the piper chooses the tune, that the Irish saying. So he who prepares these people for their future, then they stand a good chance of winning the future as well, without mentioning this and that. Thank you very much indeed.
If I may add just a small note here, actually, is just keep in mind, let's not forget Russia's new policy towards Africa, which is trying to expand in a number of African countries. And this is capitalizing on the issue of that there is high level of antagonism within a number of African countries against colonialism. And we've seen this very clearly in Niger, right, with the last coup that happened in Niger. So where there is, regardless of where the development or the assistance is coming or going, the people in Niger, they're just driven by kicking France out of the country. And we're seeing protests happening, taking place in Niger, that they're carrying the pictures of Putin, right, and the Russian flag and all of that. So the dynamics, actually, we need to think about it. It's not only about developments and assistance and all of that, but there is this dynamics of colonialism and anti-colonialism, and and Russia is capitalizing on this. So there is an addition. I agree with my friend of what he mentioned, but also I think we need to keep this issue of Russia's involvement or expansion in mind, and also we have to keep in mind that Wagner has expanded in a number of African countries as well. So the dynamics are changing in Africa, and I think we need to all keep that into consideration.
Hello, thank you for asking me here. I have a question for Dr. Welty. So I've heard the perspective that the invention of nuclear weapons and kind of the idea of mutually assured destruction has kept the major world powers from kind of the Cold War all the way to today from engaging in open conflict. and that had that happened, we'd be in a worse place today. So I'm wondering how you would respond to that.
I think that's a really convenient counterfactual, which means it's sort of a thought experiment, but we don't know that it is the presence of nuclear weapons that has kept the world safe. And in fact, we can see extreme incidences of violence that have still happened despite the presence of nuclear weapons. So I think that that's sort of, I've heard that a lot before, I think that's sort of a convenient kind of philosophical flip. But it doesn't actually hold up when we start actually looking at what the major crises have actually been. Particularly when we look at terrorism, we look at 9/11, we look at the pandemic. There are lots of ways in which nuclear weapons have not protected us, and lots of ways in which the resources that could have been used to address structural violence around the world have been diverted instead to support nuclear weapons. So I think that we never know what it is that prevents a country from going to war with another country. In some ways, I think those of us who study peace and justice studies are in a really tough position that we can never work out the particular formula in the way that our friends in the natural sciences can. We're always going to be challenged with these causal questions. So I would just say that's a really easy explanation that doesn't seem to hold up whenever we place it under more scrutiny of all of the other conflicts that have happened, and whether that kind of open, devastating conflict has been prevented through lots of acts of brilliant diplomacy, cultural contact, increased financial connections, globalization. There's so many different explanations that I'm really wary around the sort of mutually assured destruction explanation. But it's certainly a prevailing kind of current in the world in terms of looking at the way that nuclear weapons are defended. It's a great question.
Sorry to scare everyone. Other questions?
Nuclear weapons now.
Hi, thank you so much. This is for Dr. Chris Nolan. Is NATO actively challenging China like the US is in terms of economic influence?
Insider question.
That's an interesting question. Is NATO challenging China in the same way economically?
Economically like the US is.
I think that's a pretty complex question. When I was doing my research for my second book, the interviews that I conducted with U.S. strategic planners in Brussels is that I found something very, very interesting, and that is the United States has a very strategic view of its allies, not a transnational view of its allies. And that is, if we're going to provide our NATO allies with security, the American security umbrella, you can no longer trade with China, especially in dual-use technologies, and especially machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that puts the United States' allies in a very, very difficult position. And when I would interview and meet with colleagues from Germany, Italy, Spain, France, they would say, well, you've been trading with China for years, so what puts you in this particular position to tell us who we can trade or not trade with? But when it comes to certain types of, I would say, fault lines in U.S. strategic interests, and that is, my view, my conclusion is that the United States, which is prioritizing China over Russia in its foreign policy, is of the view that if you continue or if you pursue trade in the area of things like semiconductors, quantum computing, then we're going to walk away. We're going to walk away from the table. And that is a bind that the United States is putting its NATO allies in. And so that creates a pretty interesting fault line. But there's also the flip side on the economic issue, and that is the United States needs its allies to contain China, and that's the U.S. approach, is to contain not just the rise of China, but China as a strategic actor. And I know I'm speaking in strategic terms, but this is what was uncovered in my interviews and in the data that I collected for my 2 books. And so the United States needs its NATO allies and needs to form new alliance arrangements in the Pacific, but it's also telling its allies, the very allies that it needs, that they can't trade with China. And that puts especially Germany and France in a particular bind. And there's a saying that was very popular in Albania, and I found out later it was popular all throughout the Western Balkans, and probably all throughout the world, and that is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that means, yeah. And so the United States is putting its allies, it's giving it an ultimatum on economic issues. And I think a lot of what's going to determine that is NATO unity on Russia. And if you just saw the results from the latest election in Slovakia, that unity is probably crumbling. And it might not have been there at the beginning, especially with the governments in Hungary and Turkey. So I think what we could possibly see is all Putin needs to do is wait on the United States, wait for our domestic political situation to become even more dysfunctional than it is. The fact that we do not have a Speaker of the House that is going to catch the attention, of course it already has, in Russia and China as to how much dysfunction there is in the American political system. And that's a void for the American model, however flawed and however inequitable it is as a model in the world. It's going to make our brand even more, I would say, unappealing economically.
May I add something? May I add something to that? Yes. You talked about Germany and France, but you forgot one country, mine, the Netherlands.
The Netherlands.
Because there is, I think, in the world only one place where they make machines to produce chips, and in the Netherlands, ASML it's called, and we sold them, or maybe sort of still selling them to China, but the US practically forbade us to do that. But which is a bit of a complication, because in our own country, the Prime Minister also has to take care of his domestic policy. He is not going to bow to the Americans. But on the other hand, he needs the Americans too, because the Dutch are sort of leading in Europe for the, getting money and support for the war in Ukraine. So it made a very, very complicated situation because, in this case, the Americans won, and we are sort of stopping the sale of machines. Not all of them, only the new ones, and we are trying to wishy-washy a little bit of our way out of it, because it also creates a lot of jobs and employment in Holland. So it's a very hard bargain that the Americans drive, and it's very hard for other countries to deal with that.
Really quick, all the domestic legislation that I highlighted in my PowerPoint, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, all raise prices on U.S. trading partners in the European Union and in Asia. And it's gonna, those are raising tariff barriers between the U.S. and a lot of its allies. So I think that there's an economic fault line here that's going under-examined.
Hi, thank you. This question is kind of focused towards Dr. Welty, but of course, if anybody has something to say. Is there any pushback from our NATO allies against American denuclearization, or is it a largely internal pressure against denuclearization?
You might be the person to answer that.
But you may say it.
Yeah, that's a complicated question to answer with an ambassador sitting next to you.
No, I'm a free person now, free agent.
I mean, NATO is a nuclear alliance, but when we are looking at the number of nuclear weapons and the possession of nuclear weapons, what we see is that the majority of nuclear weapons in Europe are not actually French and British nuclear weapons, by the way, even though those are the two colonial countries that are the nuclear weapons possessors. But the majority of weapons in Europe are American nuclear weapons. And if we look at the approach of the public to nuclear weapons in those countries, we have growing surges of citizens of those countries that actually do not want the nuclear weapons there. So it's a question not only of nuclear policy, it's also a question around military bases and security agreements. I think one of the interesting things to look at around that question is going to be Scotland. So the majority of British nuclear weapons are actually located in Scotland. Scotland is decidedly anti-nuclear. And if the question of Scottish independence really comes up in a significant way, I think that the UK has a really serious problem about where those nuclear weapons are actually going to be based, because it's probably not going to be in Scotland. So I think that one of the things that nuclear weapons help us do as a tool, I generally don't think we should think of nuclear weapons as like a philosophical tool. I sort of divert back to, but they're weapons of mass destruction. But I think that one of the things that they introduce into the conversation in ways that are meaningful is some of these like unquestioned larger assumptions about the way that things are and who gets to decide where nuclear weapons are based, who gets to use them, who actually has the authority to push the button. Those are some pretty complicated questions that even within states that support nuclear weapons, there's some real anxiety and growing unease about that. But I'm going to hand the microphone for a perspective in Europe to answer that same question. I think it's a good question.
Well, I think often, and especially on this topic, there is often a divide between what the government thinks and what people think. Yeah. And well, my government is, I can say, in favor of them, and we also have a lot of storage of nuclear weapons. But it does not mean that the population is, because we had huge big demonstrations against all kinds of weapons. And I think if you would ask Dutch people, but it never comes up. It never comes up in an election, never. So it's not something that people are thinking about, because I think if you would ask most Dutch people, they wouldn't even know it. Which is, of course, a little bit tricky if you're fighting against nuclear weapons. But there is a lot of work to be done. And you could say that out loud, it's okay. But it is true. There is Holland is supportive of it, and they shouldn't, and they store a lot, which I also think that they shouldn't, because you don't know what that causes. Yeah.
And if I may add on the nuclear weapons, since there is such a strong interest in understanding the role of nuclear weapons in international politics and the world order, of course, yes, nuclear weapons are very important, but also keep in mind the limitations of the nuclear weapons. For example, the NATO, like, invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban regime back in 2001, and they fought for 20 years. Trillions of dollars, thousands of soldiers, and war for 20 years to replace Taliban with Taliban. So that's what happened after 20 years. So the nuclear weapons is not everything at the end of the day, because there are, not all wars are fought, right, that can nuclear weapons be relevant to this. So there are limitations where at the end of the day, the NATO withdrew from Taliban and withdrew from Afghanistan, and Taliban went back to power without, changing anything on the ground.
I think as a Japanese, I have to speak about it. And you are right, the government and the people are different actually. And also, nuclear issue will never be in the election.
Yeah.
But my government is really disappointing, I think, even to me. There is the concept of what they call declaring no first use Okay, no fast use of the nuclear weapon.
Oh, excuse me, they're saying they can't hear
Okay,
you in
so
the
sorry.
back.
And there's a concept, the country to declare, nuclear country to declare no fast use, actually. The country who declare no fast use is only China and India. I think India. And America didn't. And Russia didn't. And UK and France didn't. All right? No fast use, no fast use. And Mr. Obama was one time about to sign, all right? No fast use to be declared. Do you know who opposed that? My government. My government. Yes, Japan need America's nuclear powers umbrella. So if America declare that, okay, the government, my government failed, okay, is not so, what do you call it, uneasy, okay. America is not ready to use, in fast use of a nuclear weapon. It will affect our security. This is the way my government thinks. So my government, during Abe's time, who was assassinated, but still my current government also holds the same policy. We want America to be strong, okay, for the nuclear policy, and also nuclear sharing should be debated. Yeah. So this is my government actually. Right?
These questions are for Dr. Dolan. I hope I said that correctly. And I want to say, first of all, thank you all very much for your time. And I just wanted to ask if, let's say, the situation, between China and Taiwan were to escalate, me as a South Korean, I wanted to ask, what do you think can happen to Korean Peninsula if situation were to escalate like that dramatically? Do you think another physical conflict can occur between two Koreas again, or?
If China were to launch a full-scale military invasion of Taiwan, what would happen on the Korean Peninsula? Well, I was at a conference, this was about 2 years ago, and one of the conference attendees was a ex-chief of staff in, I forget, the previous South Korean government for the defense minister, and they had said that North Korea would attack South Korea. And then it would be, the United States and Japan would then be forced to make a choice in that particular case. And it was a flip of the coin as to where military force would be deployed. On the Korean Peninsula, there's the forces that are there, it's 27,000 US troops. The South Korean military is a incredibly amazing fighting force, and I think would be, it already serves as an incredible deterrent to North Korea's military. But I do think that the outbreak of war would take place in the Korean Peninsula. And I think it was President Biden was just shuttling between Japan and South Korea to put their differences aside and say, listen, there's a bigger, broader threat here. And that is what has raised my eyebrows, was President Biden going to Vietnam and shuttling between Tokyo and Seoul.
Thank you for coming. My question is about African politics. So I spent summer in West Africa, and I was talking with a lot of local people, and I asked a lot of questions about like the relationship with the country and African continent, and also Western countries, and also including some Asian countries. such as Japan and China. And then some people said that they want to, well, everyone said, of course, they want to develop their countries, like economically, especially. But I saw two different ideas. One is that they want to develop in any ways, so meaning that they want to get support from other countries. But the others said that they want to develop in their on their own. So like they don't really want to get support from other countries. For example, like some Senegalese people, some of them love French people. Some of them hated French people. Well, I shouldn't say people, government. So like some people didn't want French government to help them, but where some others said they do. So I saw like a dilemma in African politics where they want to develop, but the reality is that they can't, or it's less likely that they can develop themselves. So my question is, well, actually, like we talked a little bit about it previously, but is there any like movement in African Union where collectively, as an African Union, as African nations, collectively help each other, support each other financially and like in education in any ways? And you talked about like scholarships from outside, but those people, I've known that those people actually like leave countries and like study in Europe and Asia and the US, and they stay there most of the cases, and even if they come back, that's like, sorry. So yeah, sorry, that's my question. I hope you got it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's a very important question, to be honest with you. Yes, Africa's traditional diplomacy is peaceful coexistence with all. Yes, their hunger is for development and transformation. And particularly modernization as a concept in Africa happened to be, very unfortunately, modernization in Africa rather than of Africa. I think I have to unpack that in and of preposition there. In Africa, copied and pasted in Africa, which does not reflect African epistemology, African understanding, African cultural basis, but rather it was given as condition from the West, particularly from IMF and World Bank. And they had SAP, or Structural Adjustment Program, in 1980s. And they wanted all education to be financed, and all sort of universal education, and then the financing aspect, and then the bureaucratization as a whole to be modernized. And then agriculture should be, they gave specific criteria and policies, sort of imposing rather than evolving from below. And that made Africa parasite, dependent upon donors, rather than African minds, African curriculum itself, shaping the young and then preparing them to resolve conflicts and make development happen, and build the very technology from a rudimentary basis, rather just bring from outside and start. It failed. I'm very happy that you raised a Senegalese case. Yes, there is a dilemma. Some wanting to follow the French style, the French way of living, the French technology. Others genuinely say, no, well, the French is the French. Yes, the best example comes from Rwanda. Rwanda was, particularly in 70s and 80s, followers, like satellites, like acts, followers there. Then after 1994, the Rwanda genocide, and after having seen what's been happening behind the scene, then they decided not only change the language, medium of communication, medium of instruction to schools into English, and also lingua franca of Africa, there, also their development path immediately changed, and cooperation started. And your specific question, is there any Pan-African projects for development? Yes. AFCFTA, African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Area as a whole, where almost 44 countries agreed, about 34 ratified, and almost making it happen now. And the AU agenda of 2063, that where Africa's aspiration, particularly focusing on the young, and how much they can exert into that development, which is based on local economy, local knowledge, and customizing the entire education system and making it, catering into Africa's need. That is really taking place now. Again, regional mechanisms. ECOWAS, very strong one as compared to IGAD, Maghreb, and SADC, that is Southern Africa aspect. And the ECOMOG, also even the military wing as well. So they have this local development and capacity building really going on. And countries like Japan and of course South Korea and Nordic countries all together, very much, rather than giving you this, go this way, go that way, but rather helping, rather assisting and cooperating economic development are also there. And for Africa, we say there, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And Africa wants to go fast and far. Fast, because they have to focus on their indigenous knowledge. Far, because cooperation, interdependence is a must. No country is totally independent, including your country here. We need each other. So you have this interdependence and independence, going fast and going far, combined together, so Africa has its own locally developed development plan, rather than African modernization in Africa. Now, modernization of Africa is emerging. And thank you very much once more for an excellent question indeed. Thank you so much.
He's shown the last question. No, he can wait until tomorrow. All right, so we're going to have some closing comments, and you're going to be. Yeah. All right. Let me see this one. We're going to conclude with some concluding comments, and talk about tomorrow as well.
Okay, very good, very good. All right, well, thank you all so much. And I am so pleased actually with the rich discussion, the depth of the questions, the diversity of the questions. That matches very well with the diversity of the speakers we have here. And looking at what we heard from our 4 speakers actually, including Ambassador Fatima, I was really intrigued by what I heard from Professor Dolan, where he spoke about the need for NATO to start to change and to focus on the important issues, to look at issues of climate change and issues that are really significant for us, and to change course in how they do things. And then this was interestingly compared by what we heard from Professor Welty, where she said, well, but continuing with the same process of addressing nuclear weapons, but changing the methods and continue to develop the appropriate methods to address the issue of nuclear weapons, but not to change the doctrine of enough of this or we don't want this. I think that shows us that on one hand, we need approaches to continue from what she also suggested, that the question mark on is this a new Cold War was such a significant question itself to look at and to deconstruct. Yet there is an approach to continue and not to lose sight of the need for keep on the issue of nuclear and the danger of nuclear. On the other hand, we need to change and to look at issues of how NATO and other powers are looking at such issues. And that's where it was actually put together neatly by Professor Adeto, where he put it in the African context and showed that, yes, we need to change the focus of issues and to look at what is important, and meanwhile preserving this continuity of what is important, that the methods that will work, that are original, that are authentic. And I think he put it nicely with the Ubuntu statement that I am because you are. And that becomes kind of the way that we need to connect as a universal community. And then your questions came and just really put it all together so nicely. And I'm just so thrilled to see the Juniata community being here and showing us the caliber of our students and our community. I will, tomorrow, same thing. We're going to be here at 6. Hope to see the full room again with 3 wonderful speakers that we have representing Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East as well. And then, of course, all that. We're going to miss tomorrow Professor Welty, who will have to depart, Professor Adetto, who will also have to depart early in the morning. So can we please give them a hand of applause? Thank you so much. I hope you realize how much you enriched our community, even by a short presentation of 20 minutes and addressing the questions. We hope this is only a beginning of continuing visits to Juniata and continued collaboration. I'll stop talking and I will turn it to our director, Zia Haq, to close this and with statement. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Please allow me, please join me to thank Dr. Nagingas for keeping us on track. We're not finishing our right in time. So please.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wonderful moderation of our presentation today. Just allow me to do a kind of a promo for PACS. If you feel like these are space, these are dialogue that you feel like you are engaged, productive, please try to take some PACS classes. A lot of freshmen. This is the biggest cohort in our history of our college. So please try to take some PACS classes, engage with us. If you're excited by the presentation of Dr. Welty about how you can do what things, little small things that you can do to make a difference, engage with us. We have a division funding applications. If you see this slight connection with your interest, talk to us. So I just wanted to thank you all for patience being here today, and I want to invite you to come tomorrow again to have this regional presentation from Middle East, from Netherlands, from Europe, and from Japan. So I'm sorry. So with that, I just wanted to, like, my takeaways from this panel, wonderful panel. I will start with Dr. Aditya. I think its baseline is like you cannot impose a Western therapy in Africa, right? You need to really understand the context, the cultures, the diversity, the issues. And Africa has been abused many times, the power play, playing ground, Horn of Africa, right? It brought a lot of issues, election issues, violence, and other mining issues related to natural conflict. And Dr. Welty was inviting you to engage in the dialogue, how we can change, how we can reclaim your agency, and do something to make a huge difference. You'll be the agents in future. You'll be graduating, engaging in dialogue. Probably one day you'll be the policymaker in the congressman, voting your speaker out, which is okay. This is a nice beauty of democracy, right? But you will also make an interesting, important policy globally that will impact our lives. So think about that. And also from Dr. Dolan's presentation was inviting you to reflect it, to change the narrative, like, do not divide us into a false dichotomy. We are better than others. I know morality doesn't apply to politics, classical realism. Dr. Nagingas would agree with me. But there is a space that we can also create a space for others, how we can preserve our interests, but also look at the stake of others, right? So let us live and let live. This is going to be our founding principles. That's the message I wanted to, once you step out, take this message. And finally, thank you so much. I really was blown away by the questions, the quality of questions from you. Please try to think about PACS in future and also politics classes, okay? Okay, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.